Welcome to the Poison Pen Bookstore. It's a real treat to have David Corbett back. It's been a while.
Has been a while.
Yeah, and we're here to talk about his new book, The Long Lost Love Letters of Doc Holliday, which is a fascinating book, and I'm really interested. There's so much to talk about with this. First thing, I guess the first question is, how the heck did you come across this particular concept? This is quite a departure from anything you've done before.
Well, yeah, and somebody said, this is a departure even for you. And I thought, yeah, I'm following that path, which is the path to who knows where. But this was in the back of my mind for a long time. Even before I started writing crime fiction, I had discovered in reading one of the biographies of Doc Holliday about this correspondence that he had with his cousin, who became a nun. So the first thing, the gunman and the nun, I mean, right away I'm there. I'm thinking this is fascinating. And then when you find out that there's hints that they were lovers, it becomes even more fascinating.
Irresistible.
Yeah, so you think, well, what's not to write about? The problem was, until just about 10 or 12 years ago, there really weren't any good biographies of Doc Holliday. The ones that came out, there were two that came out in the 50s. And that's a lot of the stuff that you see in the movies from that era is very much based on that mythography. And they really were a patchwork of myth and newspaper stories that were almost always inaccurate, and a lot of other sources that just they were the biographies were more novelistic than they were real biographies. But Dr. Gary Roberts, I think in 2006, he came out with a definitive, really well-researched biography. He's a historian. And once that came out and you began to be able to say, okay, this is likely, this is not likely, this couldn't have happened. Doc couldn't have killed those 20 people. He wasn't there, That was a different J. Holliday. That was, and actually did all that legwork and figured these things out. It became much more likely that I could do it and not feel as though I was just stepping off a cliff into the abyss of rumor. However, it still comes back to, well, what about these two people? I mean, were they really in love? The family absolutely denies it. And the other good book that came out in this last 15 years or so was a biography by a family member, Karen Holliday Tanner, who is related to one of Doc's aunts. And it was a family story. Some of the stuff within it has been debunked by Gary Roberts, saying that may be family lore, but it's unlikely it happened. And so, again, you realize that you're constantly dealing with shifting sands, but there clearly was a strong connection between the two of them. And a couple facts made it even more fascinating. One, she destroyed the letters. When Doc died, there were rumors that Big Nose Kate, the woman he had lived with, the prostitute who became his sort of common law wife, this is very common in the West. Women who had worked as prostitutes would find a man that would work, that they could live with, and that would become a common law wife. Wyatt Earp, a great number of Western heroes that we know, that was sort of how the arrangement worked. But she's a very odd character. I mean, they clearly were both drunks. They both fought tooth and nail. Her memoirs came out in the 30s when she found out Wyatt Earp had a memoir, and she hated Wyatt Earp, and he hated her. And when she found out that she had spoke ill of her, she wanted her story to get out. And she had given it to this guy to write, but when she found out she wasn't going to get paid for it, she declined to give the go-ahead. But these papers didn't exist. They weren't extant until like the 80s. So now that we find this out, it ends up that she talked about Doc, but never lovingly. The guy she talks lovingly about is Johnny Ringo. So you're thinking, what's going on here?
Sounds like the Kardashians or something.
Oh, yeah. And just dustier. But the one thing we do know, the only woman mentioned in Doc's obituary is Maddie, his cousin. And his belongings were apparently shipped back to Atlanta. And she was so afraid of family scandal, she would not go pick them up. She had her uncle go pick them up. And so she had all of her letters to him, and all of his letters to her, obviously. And the ones that were fit for family reading, she gave to one of her sisters, and on Sundays they would bring them out and read these wonderful stories about the West. And apparently he was quite a wonderful writer and was very descriptive about the West. But she kept a certain number of them to herself. And she lived until about 1938. And it was in 1929 and 28, two big biographies came out about Wyatt Earp and about the whole OK Corral situation. One was called Iliad of the West, and the other one was just a Wyatt Earp biography. And in both of them, especially because the wives of Wyatt Earp and Virgil Earp were quoted, they were not fond of Doc. They felt that, for reasons I'll get into if we talk about the OK Corral, they really thought that he was a drag on the reputations of Virgil and Wyatt. And they just called him, you know, the vituperative dentist or something, and these kind of things. And Maddie said, when she still had the letters, that if only people could have known Doc the way she knew him, especially through his letters, they would have a much different view of him. So I hung my hat on that. You know, that she really wished she could show people who she really was, but couldn't at that time, apparently, or didn't want to at that time.
Can you set up a little bit about kind of the history about what took him, what made him flee Georgia?
Well,
That's
one last thing about when she became a nun, she chose the name Sister Melanie. And that's interesting for two reasons. One, Margaret Mitchell, who wrote Gone with the Wind, was related to the Holidays. And the character Melanie in Gone with the Wind is based on Maddie. But Melanie is an interesting choice of a name for the saint, because Saint Melanie married her first cousin. And the reason Maddie supposedly gave Doc why she wouldn't marry him was because she was Catholic. And in Catholicism, you cannot marry your first cousin. So there was just enough there to say, you know, I can go into that, that it was a romance. I don't have to feel like I'm just making it up. There was enough that I could work with. Now, as far as why he left the West, he gave two reasons. The whole myth that he left for his health is nonsense. He had tuberculosis. His mom had died of tuberculosis, and a close family friend had as well. And he was with her, his mother, through to the end. And the father remarried 3 months after the mother died, and Doc never forgave his dad for that. And it was a woman who lived down the road, and she was only 7 years older than Doc, who was 16 at the time. So Doc just hated him for that and never forgave him. Also, he was the head of the Freedmen's Bureau, which, as far as Doc was concerned, was consorting with the enemy. He still, thought the Confederacy should have won. So there was a lot of rancor at home, especially toward his dad. But when he got tuberculosis, there's a lot of places he could have gone, spas and hot springs throughout the South. And in fact, the family had property close to one. And there was another one in Atlanta. So he didn't need to go west for that. And in fact, when he went west, he went to Dallas. You don't go to Dallas for your lungs. I mean, when he got there, he said, 2 weeks earlier, a yellow fever outbreak had just come out, and they used pigs to clean up the horse dung in the streets. So that wasn't the point. He actually went to Dallas to clean up. He joined the Temperance Society. He went to the Methodist Church, and why he converted to Methodism is another interesting story. But and then he started a dental practice, but it fell apart because he got into gambling, and he began to drink because that was how he dealt with the pain and the coughing of the tuberculosis. The two reasons he gave for leaving, he gave one to Bat Masterson, which was that some black youths had been swimming in a family watering hole on property along the Georgia-Florida border. And he had asked them to leave. They were very rude as far as Doc was concerned, so he took out a pistol and and depending on who tells the story, he shot over their heads, he shot one in the back, or he slaughtered them all. And there is no contemporary record of this, by the way, so nobody knows if it's really true or not, but this is what he told Bat Masterson. And it's part of family lore. Everybody says that they sort of realized that Doc's temper was getting the better of him at this time, and his drinking was getting a little worse, and his gambling was shaming the family, and they thought maybe it would be best for him to leave. But he also told Gilly Otero, who's the son of the governor of the New Mexico Territory, that he had been jilted by a woman he had been in love with, and that's why he came west. So one more thing to hang that, no, they were lovers. And also, just as a novelist, I mean, if you're really going to go here, and I mean, the prevailing theory is that they were just really close, and because she was a nun, she was worried about him. So she kept the correspondence going out of this sort of like, spiritual, trying to make sure that he didn't fall too far off the path, which is probably true, but it's not interesting as a novelist. So I went, no, they were definitely in love, and that made me have to research, well, what were love letters like in the 19th century? And it turns out that this was a really fascinating time to be in love. because the chaperone system was beginning to fall apart. So women were having to negotiate on their own terms with the men who were trying to court them, which meant that they didn't have somebody else to say, my big brother will kill you if you do anything bad to me. So they pretty much had to negotiate on their own terms, and this is why so many of the letters at the time consisted of proofs of love. If you love me, you will do this, or you'll show me this way. And a lot of the letters back from the men were either expressing their love in a particular way, or demonstrating, in some other way that their emotions were honorable. And I thought, I think I can run with that. And the whole notion of that Doc was saying, if he was going to use a proof of love, if you really love me, why can't you give up Catholicism? My mother converted on her deathbed. She converted to Presbyterianism to suit my father. But she couldn't stand Presbyterianism because they believe in predestination. And she didn't want Doc believing that his fate was already in God's hands and was done, that his actions didn't mean anything. So she went back to Methodism on her deathbed for him. And he joined the Methodist church for her. And so he's trying to tell Maddie, well, look, my mother did it. You're going to tell me that she wasn't a virtuous person? Does God really care that much about that? So he's like trying to play on, if you come out here, we can escape the family scandal, and we can be together. And her proof of love is, no, you need to be part of the family. If you come back and are part of the family, we'll talk. Or at least I can care for you here. And so this is what I thought, this would be the negotiation in the letters, and that's kind of where the letters went from there. And the longer he stayed out west, the less traction she had with him. And but the more desperately he needed her as his life began to fall apart.
Then you also have, as you have these letters kind of going along throughout the story, which have a momentum of their own. They're building towards something.
Well, that was a trick. I realized if I was going to put the letters in the book, they had to have an arc.
Right. Well, and then you have the contemporary story too. We haven't talked about that yet. Tell us a little bit about. I'm going to get her name wrong. Lisa Palomar. Is that right?
Yeah. Well, first of all, Lisa's interesting because of where she came from. I'd started this book as a follow-up to The Mercy of the Night, which was published by Thomas and Mercer, Amazon, and I wasn't really crazy about them or how they dealt with the book, but I liked my protagonist. So I was beginning the book that way, and then my agent said, look, if you want to go out with this book to another publishing house, I can't sell the second book in a series to another publishing house, so you might want to rethink that. And then she said, also, everybody's looking for strong female protagonists. Why don't you do that? So I switched it around, and he was a lawyer, I made it a female lawyer. But so I have a number of women lawyer friends, so I prototyped for that. But at our wedding 4 years ago, my wife's from the Philadelphia area, and she had a friend named Lisa Iaboni. And Lisa impressed me in a really amazing way. It was at the wedding, there's that moment where they call out, all the single women come out on the dance floor, it's the bouquet toss. And all my women friends are at least one divorce beyond the last mistake they made. So there's no way they were going out there. I just said, So, but, my wife's younger, and she had a friend who's game for anything, and Linda was out there all alone, except for the 4-year-old daughter of one of our other couple friends. And it was a moment of we're all kind of going, oh God, this is really awkward. And then suddenly this voice comes from the back, and she's going, all right, buddy, come here. And she's this brunette in this red dress, pushes up her sleeves, says, come on, buddy, throw it to me. It was Lisa. And she had only met Linda like 2 weeks before at the bachelorette party. But she just said, I was not going to let my new BFF stand out there like that. And I just fell in love with her. I thought, I love this person. You're now part of the family as far as I'm concerned. And then I thought, I can build a character with that big Philly Italian heart. Then, a lawyer's brain. And I wanted to give her a rough backstory. And so I took another Italian I know, the poet Kim Adenizio, who's been known to go to writers' conferences, and whenever they want things to perk up, to say, Kim, do something, and she'll strip down to her underwear and jump into the fountain. And among the more mild things she has done. So I kind of put the three of those together, and that's where I came up with her. The issue of, if the letters reappear, given the fact that everybody says they're destroyed, the first question you ask is, well, they must be forged. And to keep that alive through the course of the book, I wanted somebody who was an expert in forgery to have some connection to them. But I didn't want him to be a document forger because I thought that would be too obvious. So I came up with the character Tuck Mercer, who just kind of came to me bit by bit. But you know, he had been a rodeo rider as a kid, and he was a sketch artist outside. They called him the Rodeo Rembrandt, you know, and for $2 he'd do your caricature or your sketch outside the rodeo, you know. And he met this girl, this rich girl who like he fell in love with, and she fell in love with him. So one rodeo, he decides, I'm really going to impress her, I'm going to ride a bull he has no business riding. And just because he's afraid of falling off, he does a suicide rap. And within seconds, he's thrown, and then he's just dragged by the bull until he finally tears free, and then he gets gored and trampled, and he's almost dead. And that's the end of the rodeo career, and the family takes her away, and he never sees her again, and he begins saying, what am I going to do? And there's enough of a vengeance, like, you know, I have been mistreated by fate, that he goes to Los Angeles. He works with a firm that does the repair of old paintings and stuff. And this is where a lot of forgers learn their craft. I've learned this from Caveat Emptor, which is a wonderful book about a great art forger in the New York area, and how you learn how to mimic even the fly droppings. A lot of these things have been kept in old paintings have been lost in barns and stuff, and these little brown specks in the corners because flies are attracted to the varnish. And there's a particular technique you can use to imitate those fly droppings, and how you can imitate, you know, the tears on the back of paint. They've been ruined. You can imitate that, and what would they have used to repair it? And so,
I liked a little bit about how he somehow mines the old solvent off of kind of worthless period.
oh yeah, that's it. Yeah,
and uses them.
you go and find these old, you know, these paintings were made by some crank,
Right.
you know, in 1850, and then they're just monstrosities. They look like the act of a lunatic, but that's not what he wants. He wants the frame, because the frame will be authentic at the time, and then you can using a solvent, you can take that paint off and mix it, and it's an authentic paint from the time. Because these things you can't, you know, there's certain aging things you can't fake, and so he gets very good at this, and he begins mimicking Western painters because he thinks there's a place to do that, and he ultimately gets better and better. And there's a dealer. A lot of these guys have to work with shady dealers, and there's one guy who's willing to look. I know a market. And it's China. All these rich people from China.
The Bling Dynasty.
The Bling Dynasty, yeah. When I read that in an article, I thought, that is too funny. And he begins selling these paintings to these rich, you know, collectors. And he gets known as the man who forged the West. But, you know, you get a little sloppy, and finally he does a painting of a Choctaw chief who couldn't possibly have been alive at the time that the painter he's imitating would have painted him. And he gets caught and gets arrested, and he reforms, and this is where the story begins. He's been reformed for 3 years. This young arts attorney has helped him develop his business and worked out contracts with the various museums and galleries, and she's in love with him. He thinks he's, you know, it, and she's totally smitten with him, and he asks a favor. He says, I have these letters, there's probably, maybe they're real, maybe they're not, I don't know, but the woman they belong to is a descendant of a slave who had worked with the Holliday family, then stayed with the Holliday family until she passed away in 1932, I think. And that they got lost. That it was during the Depression. She put them in the safe deposit box with an African-American bank in Brooklyn. Failed. Gave it over to another one. Failed. And the comptroller took these things over. And the comptroller held on to a lot of these safe deposit box holdings for like 50 years. Until the late 80s, when they finally just started publishing, look, pick it up now or give it up. And the woman who owns them now, her grandmother's a little squirrely, and she sees it and she makes the claim and she collects them. She doesn't know what to do with them. She leaves them alone. Until finally she has a stroke. She realizes, oh, you know, I'm not going to live forever. I want these to go to my granddaughter. She gives them to Tuck. Says, can you authenticate these? And before he can do that, she passes away. So so there's a little estate issue that I kind of threw in there that they kind of fudge on, you know, who do they really belong to? But basically, it's like, well, they were supposed to be given to her. They're hers. She can't pay for authentication. You know, it's going to cost tens or not hundreds of thousands of dollars for all the experts are going to be needed to verify that these are genuine. But they have value. There's collectors who will collect them anyway. We can sell them to one of these guys. I happen to know one. Will you do the sale? You know, if I'm involved, being a previous forger, nobody's going to trust that they're legitimate. But if you represent her, I think we can do it. So that's where the book starts. And as adventure stories. That's the beginning, and then everything goes downhill from there.
This character, the prospective buyer, Judge Littman.
Yes.
Right. What inspired him, that particular guy?
Well, sort of just the situation down here. I mean, actually, he was kind of based on Judge Mike Gray, who was a prominent judge in Tombstone, notorious for trying to steal land. There was a land title issue in early Tombstone where some group of people tried to claim that the original land grants were illegitimate, so they tried to scarf them up. To the point of when there was a fire in Tombstone in 1881, they sent guys out to sit on the lots where things had burned down to say, no, you can't buy, this is our property now. So it was, and he was part of that. And his son was one of the cowboys, the rustler group that was notorious for going down into Mexico, stealing cattle, bring them back up, and selling them to the army, among other people, but also the butchers in Tombstone and various other people, or selling them to the ranchers in the area. And he died not long before, not Judge Mike Gray, but his son, Dixie Lee was his name, Dixie Lee Gray, died in I think it was called the Skeleton Canyon Massacre. And it's where Old Man Clanton died as well, the father of Ike Clanton, who was the major figure in the gunfight at the OK Corral.
Right.
So they're all kind of connected. So this sort of corrupt judge is just sort of, but knowing enough about modern politics, I realized how easy it is to clean up your reputation. It's his two underlings that actually came from cases I worked on. And one is a former defense attorney who gets caught on cocaine and begins snitching on his clients. And do you know who was guilty of doing that as a prosecutor? Scott Turow.
What?
Scott Turow.
Stop the tape.
Scott Turow was a prosecutor in Chicago who turned defense lawyers against their clients. And it became a big thing. And then he resigned from the U.S. Attorney's Office and became a defense lawyer. I just think you can't make that stuff up. And I didn't know that until I did the research. We had actually worked on a case of a bunch of marijuana smuggler guys whose lawyer was actually a secret DEA informant and was actually working against the client that he was charging $1 million fee and got that up front while he's snitching on the client. I mean, it was pretty amazing. So that guy, Rankin, is based on him. And the wannabe mafioso was based on a guy named Joe Stadino. I think I may have told you about this guy. He actually was instrumental here in Arizona. Remember the ab scam thing?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, he was the supposed mafioso. We ran into him in, again, another money laundering case where he pretended to be a mafioso. He was born in Pittsburgh. His name was Joe Stead. He did a couple petty crimes back east, like West Virginia, Ohio. Then he came out to Las Vegas and became a midnight movie host. And he changed his name to Stadino. And the joke about him was, he's the only guy in the history of Las Vegas who ever added about at the end of his name. And he wanted to be a gangster so bad. He wanted to be accepted by the Italian community so bad. And they just hated him. I talked to Johnny Spilatro, Tony Spilatro's brother, about him. He said, he'd get up there, just go, get away from me. At the San Gennaro Festival where all the Italians show up. And just get away from me. But he was a little petty criminal, and then he got caught on some cross-border money orders or traveler's checks things, and became a federal informant. But he was still connected to some mob guys like Chris Petty in San Diego, who ran gambling in San Diego and worked with the mob in Las Vegas. But ultimately, he just, when Tony Dan Spilatro, who was his main connection and protector, was killed by Weasel Fradiano, he got terrified.
Weasel Fradiano.
Weasel Fradiano.
That's a great name.
Yeah.
Boy, I can't believe you didn't put that in the book.
Well, it's too convoluted, and
Okay.
it's when you're giving that much backstory to a minor character, you're really getting lost in the weeds. I'm just saying because it's kind of funny, But Stadino then became, what happened was he was a midnight movie host, he always wanted to be on film, he becomes an informant, and they're filming the transactions where he's handing the money to the drug dealers, and and he's on film finally. He's in the movies. And he's like, this is my dream. And this is the ab scam thing was where he got to play the,
Did he
and
get
it's
whacked?
like, what?
Did he get whacked?
No, I think he died quietly. He wrote a book, he actually wrote a memoir. And I remember reading the first chapter going, I know that every single word of this is untrue.
Wow.
And then he just kind of quiet. I think he died of a heart attack in late 80s or early 90s or something. And but the muscle guy who's pretending to be a mafioso was very much based on him.
Well, I wanted to ask you a little bit about, you talked about some kind of the original creation of some of these myths about these guys. And, I know the Indian stuff fairly well, and a lot of the biographies of like those famous Indian figures came out during that time, 30s, 40s, when a lot of it's in living memory, still. And, and that becomes the gospel, for a while. And then in the 80s, 90s, and now, all these books are coming out that kind of say, it really wasn't really like that.
Yeah.
And kind of reevaluating that whole thing.
No, this is an interesting period to be watching Western history.
Yeah.
I'm reading right now that there's small press. You don't know where to take them, but there's like we're going to rectify the whole notion that whites captured by the Indians actually were accepted by the Indians and taken in. We're going to show just how brutal they were to their white captives. Well, sometimes that's true. You can tell from the point of view of the pros that we really got an axe to grind, and yet some of these stories were true. But what's fascinating is that usually when they got young boys to join, they never wanted to go back.
Right.
They sort of like they had been more accepted and they were taught more things being part of an Indian tribe than they had been being white, sons of farmers. And they thought, no, this is the way I want to
They
live.
had more fun, right?
Yeah. And women would get hazed very badly, but very often they then became part of the community. But the problem is, depending on what tribe, like the Comanches were terrible to the women. But the Kiowa were not, and I don't believe the Cherokee were either. So you had a reasonable, decent status. And if you got married to an Indian, you were just part of the group. Nobody ever thought about it again. But the Comanches, the thing I found out recently about the Comanche was that once the Civil War was over, they were the largest slaveholder in the United States. And it was a kind of problem. We just defeated a bunch of secessionist states over this issue, and now this Indian nation in the Southwest is guilty of the same thing. What do we do? Do we conduct another war? Which is basically what they did, but they didn't do it over slavery. And also slavery with the Comanches was a really different thing. And it wasn't quite bondage slavery where you're property, but you were definitely not free to leave.
And they also needed new members for their tribe.
Yeah, because they were dying.
Dying
Yeah, especially the drought from I think 1845 to 1860. There was a 15-year drought throughout the plains that just wiped those tribes out. That they'd lost like 50% of their population. And then you add to that the disease, and it was really yeah.
Well, about the OK Corral in particular, I mean, Jeff Gwynne had that book that came out a few years ago.
That's a
There
great
have been
book.
a number of
Yeah,
books
yeah.
about it.
Jeff Gwynne's book is really good. There's and Die in the West by Palomar. So it was really the beginning of the scholarly look at the West, especially that Tombstone area.
Right.
And after her, there was Casey Turf-Tuller's biography of Wyatt Earp, which I think was the basis for the Wyatt Earp movie that Kevin Costner did.
What an amazing arc of a life that guy had, by the way. Living into the 30s?
Yeah.
Getting involved in Hollywood?
Yeah, no, and he was really jealous of his story, and that's why the couple guys tried to do his biography, and he was really, and Josie was very jealous of his legacy, and that whenever anything negative came out, she would not let that come to print.
Do you remember Bob Parker talking about it? Because
Yeah.
he wrote one of his books about Josie and Wyatt, and he did a lot of research into it. He was a scholar,
Yeah.
at heart, so.
She's-
Josie Marcus.
Josie Marcus is
she
an
was-
amazing story.
Really is.
She was, at first connected with Johnny B.
Right.
And I read one of the other books I read. I just wanted to get the other take on Johnny B. And there's a guy here in Arizona who wrote a book, and by darn it, Johnny's the hero of this story.
Yeah, but wasn't there a lot, in the 30s? Wasn't some of the publishing really sort of for sensationalist press, or there was a reason to, a lot of magazine. I mean, it was, Chandler, all those guys. So those kinds of stories really fit, at that time. The
Well,
more
also,
sensational you could make them, the better they would sell.
Well, you also had the beginning of the gangster ethos.
Yeah. Yes.
And with the whole notion of the Western lawman, sort of fit into, it's contemporary but not. In fact, forget what I read recently, but they said when the dime novels of the late 19th century, the man who knows Indians became the man who knows criminals, as the detective stories became more and more in urban based as opposed to plains based, and so it's really natural for these kind of stories to fit that time.
Yeah, it really is. If you go over to Santa Fe, they have a new museum on the plaza, and part of it is they've got exhibitions about all these New Mexican versions. So you've got Billy the Kid and the sheriff and various famous gunfights or whatever it all is, and they tried to fit it into the rest of the history of the state. And part of it was just there was no law enforcement, regular law enforcement. So this kind of stuff happened, and then as everything got more civilized.
In other words, as more and more women showed up.
Well,
most stories about the West are about
yeah.
as the women came.
What's the movie with John Wayne and Jimmy Stewart? That real classic. About,
Liberty Valance.
Yeah, exactly. The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance is a clear example of that. But also, as you got more law enforcement and all, then people wanted to sort of clean up the Legends group. But on the other hand, they also wanted to protect some things. So I think it's the same thing with Tombstone. We'll never really know. I mean, have you been there? To Tombstone?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I went to the museum.
It's weird to walk around there,
I know.
and think, well, what really did happen?
No, I had to talk to. There's a guy who actually did a biography of Wyatt Earp, but he actually plays Doc Holliday in the thing, and I had to kind of pretend he was Doc Holliday as I'm talking to him.
But I mean,
because he says, don't ruin my gig, man. Exactly. Okay,
it's
fine.
a little teeny place, I mean, you think all this stuff happened, and
Well, Tombstone died within just a couple of years because there was the monsoon winds. They flooded out all those the silver mines, and they were pretty much tapped out anyway. They were rapidly running out, and the cost of getting the pumps in there and pumping it out was just prohibitive. So ultimately, the Cowboys, sort of became the ones who won because they stayed, whereas the miners moved on, and or they moved into Bisbee to do the copper mining. But that Wyatt Earp represented the Republican element, and what was interesting is that Doc, being a diehard Democrat from the South, had a reversal of allegiance, at meeting Wyatt and then sort of realizing, no, this is progress. And that was another bone of contention. I bring it up in the letters because Maddie refused to enter the convent until she could enter in Savannah, because there was no way she was going north, because she blamed the North for the death of her father, because he had been a prisoner of war and he was a broken man when he got home. And she, I just love this though, the Catholic nun who couldn't forgive. I just find that fascinating. So anyway.
Well, there are a lot of rabbit holes in this story. You can
Oh
go
no,
down
there really
right
are.
there. It's amazing.
And well, it's a fascinating time, and the whole notion of that the West was populated by guys leaving the war, and they didn't want to stay in the South. They were not going to live under that the Reconstruction regime. The West was wide open. I guess it was one cavalry officer. A lot of these guys joined the cavalry and then they deserted. And the guy said, if it weren't for desertion, the West wouldn't have been populated. And
well, a bunch of the guys that established Phoenix were, especially Jack Swilling. He was an ex-Confederate guy.
Well, most of the cowboys were. Their allegiances were Texas or with the Confederacy, and most of the money men were Northerners, and so their allegiance was to the North. And that was one of the reasons why the politics was so poisonous. And I'm reading an article right now about the new corruption, which isn't about bribery. It's so much as there's a small group of people who basically control the narrative of the country. And they go from government to think tanks, from think tanks to media, from media to think tank, and it's the same small group of people. And that the truth is a part of a performance. And it's interesting. She's an anthropologist, where she says this resembles the last days of it. It says remembers the last days of communism in Eastern Europe, where where you went for the news was the satirists, because they almost always were more reliable than the actual news order, which is one of the reasons with Colbert and Jon Stewart how they became prominent. But there's the flaw in the ointment is when she says you can tell this by the sort of performance rhetoric in the news. And I go, have you ever read a 19th century newspaper? Go back and read the Nugget or the Epitaph from Tombstone. And I mean, the prose couldn't be more florid or more, propagandistic. The guy who was pro-Earp, he was both the mayor and he ran the newspaper that was pro-Republican, was named John Clum. And at first you kind of
Is he
think
the
that,
Apache agent?
yes, the Apache agent, the guy who tried to get the Indians to perform Gilbert and Sullivan plays. I was kind of on his
didn't know
side
that.
until I learned that,
I didn't know
and then I
that.
he'd lost me. And the woman, Paula Marx, who wrote And to Die in the West, which is much more of a pro-Arizona cowboy story than a pro-Earp story. Her interpretation was the first one to really dig at the mythology of the Earps. She brings up the fact that Klum, when you really read his articles, they are just a little too florid. There's something oily about the prose that's
His
just a little
memoirs
bit.
are pretty interesting.
Is it really?
Yeah. I didn't know about the Gilbert and Sullivan thing. That's
No,
pretty
that's
great.
fabulous.
That was
That
in,
is awesome.
that was in a book about the Apache that I read.
Really? I missed that detail.
You just see the gondoliers.
Yeah, yeah.
They're rowing.
On poor little buttercup.
Right.
No.
Yeah, that's
Um,
HMS Pinafore.
Well, I wanted to ask you also about kind of the black market of these these relics, these
Mhm.
historical relics. I'm sure you had to do a little bit of digging into that whole world.
A little bit. Here's the problem. I did, but I didn't want to. That was definitely one of those rat holes. I thought if I go into there, then it's so full of characters that if I walk too much into it, it's going to take over the book. And I wanted to keep it much more in terms of. This is going to sound odd, but one of the things that I thought about when first conceiving the book, I saw where the ranch was. I knew what the dragoons looked like. It's almost embarrassing to admit. It reminded me of the guns in Navarone. And I remember that they had to get behind and climb over the cliff to come down. And I thought, I wanted an adventure story like that. I wanted these guys who decide to, look, where I come from, somebody steals something from me, you don't hire a lawyer, you just go steal it back. And these 4 Marines decide, we're just going to go get those damn letters. But they're not, frontal assault's not going to work. So they do the whole, Battle of Montreal thing. We're going to come from behind. And that was part of I just thought, there's something about that. I want to write that adventure story. So that was going to require so much. But once I do that, and I do the legal aspect, and I've really been gratified at the number of lawyers who told me, boy, you really get the courtroom thing down. Because, obviously I worked with lawyers for a long time. I was married to a lawyer. And I had a lawyer helping me with it. But still, it's a universe unto itself, and to make most courtroom things dramatic without making them phony is hard. But I think I pulled that off. But putting all of that, if I put one more thing into the sausage, the skin was going to burst.
Was Nico based on anybody in particular?
Wait a minute.
Is it Nico? I'm missing the name.
Her partner?
Yeah.
Not really.
He seemed like a
He sort of,
character.
he was a character. Well, the guy who comes from money, who decides, I can play it being an arts lawyer, and
got
he's
a
quite
man
good at it.
bun and the
Yeah,
whole deal.
yeah. And is actually a pretty decent dude, and is actually, secretly in love with her, and can't come to the fore about it, and but is there when she needs him. Is the one person who is there, except for my faithful Indian character. And I almost made when I was writing the book, I was going, God, I like this guy a lot.
We can't give too much away though.
No, but I was sitting there going, I needed to. I gave at the end of the book, there's a line that I actually stole from something that happened to me. It was about Stadino. I found one of his ex-wives, and she was working in San Antonio with a radio, and she was delightful. She'd been a young, stupid so-and-so, and she married this guy. She said, I was the wife, So, yeah, he's out all night with his friends. I just figured that's normal, and couldn't get away from it fast enough. Finally ends up in San Antonio, told me some great stories, and she had some pictures of him hanging out with the San Diego mob. So we got along great. The second day I came back to pick up the pictures, had lunch, and as I was leaving, she said, you seem like a very nice young man, and I hope I never see you again. And I always wanted to use something like that line, and I get to use it in this one. So I won't tell you where or how.
Great.
What else you got going on? What are some other projects you're working on?
Well, I've got another writing craft book in the
great.
pipeline. Writer's Digest has picked it up because I'm now a contributing editor there, and I write a number of articles for them every year. In fact, I just finished one called In Defense of the One-Dimensional Character. There's been all this talk, oh no, characters have to. I go, no, really. Let's talk about some great one-dimensional characters. And obviously Hercule Poirot or Reacher. There's a number of just because somebody has a past doesn't mean they have more than one dimension. And the way I describe that is, that every character has 3 basic conflict arcs or struggle arcs: external, internal, and interpersonal. If your character just has an external arc, it doesn't make them uninteresting. It just means the conflict is all external. But that doesn't mean that they're having identity issues or authenticity issues, and they don't need them. If they don't bother with them. And I bring up like Sister Angela in Heaven Knows Mr. Allison. Miranda in The Collector. You know, I mean, yeah, she has a very interesting life that, you know, she has lost. But the truth of the matter is, she's got one, you know, action arc, and that is get this guy to let me go. And so, you know, that was the most recent article. And this book is called The Compass of Character, and it's based on all the stuff I learned about character after I wrote the first book, and which is embarrassing. The more I delved into the whole issue of what characters want, which is the crucial question you asked, the more I realized that it was much meatier than I had been able to talk about in the first book. And this came out in teaching, and I talked about this with Donald Moss, and he said, you know, that's why you teach before you write the book, as opposed to after, because you find out, oh yeah, I didn't know that. So this one is pretty much about deep motivation, and the 2 main conflicting drives that motivate every character, which is protection from the pain of life and pursuit of the promise of life. And they're very often at cross purposes. And how do you approach backstory to explore that, and how do you create that as the forward-moving drive in the story? And then I'm working, since you think this thing is out of the way for me, the thing I'm working on right now is totally out of left field. And I just tell people it's a dystopian novel about the present with an immortal protagonist.
It's a good book.
Wow.
Probably that's all you should say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, the title is Helpless Immortal,
Yeah.
because he has no magic powers. He can't do anything.
Not a vampire.
No. He just he's cursed to live and die and live and die and live and die over and over again because of something he did. And he thought there was an escape. The way his curse was worded, he thought there was an escape. And he found out about 500 or 1,000 years in that, oh, that was a trick. And so now he has to go, every time I come here, what am I going to do? And he's just decided, well, it ain't about me anymore. So he finds somebody to help. And he's a classic traveling angel. And in this, there's a young, fragile, but brilliant poet and painter who wrote a book for her teacher who she was in love with. And then the teacher dumped her. She had a nervous breakdown. The teacher steals the book, and it becomes an international sensation. And our hero decides, you know what, we got to make this right.
Speaking of visual arts, did you know a lot about kind of the history of Western painting?
I did. I had to learn that, and there was a wonderful book about techniques, of specific techniques of those Western writers, and it was wonderful and completely eye-opening about, you know, the various ways they got their pigments, and in particular, Ralph Blakelock, the American Van Gogh, who goes nuts, and when he's in an asylum becomes the most imitated, you know, forged painter in American history. There's all these fake Blakelocks out there, probably more fakes than there are originals. But his painting techniques are just, he would use like axe handles and cleavers to get the texture on the paint, and he would put silver underneath everything so that the sort of light would come out through the paintings, and they're just, I didn't even know he existed, and now I'm a total fan. There was an exhibit in New York of some of his works, and I wanted to go so bad, but it was something where we just couldn't do it, and I just felt like I really lost an opportunity. But you also learned that some of the little minor artists that you'd never heard about, you know, Farney and Bierstadt, who sort of came from the Hudson School and then just brought it to the West. I don't know, it just opened up the Western art to me in a way that was.
You mentioned Maynard Dixon too.
Yeah, Maynard Dixon. Well, of course, and while I'm working on this book, one of my students is working on a book in which it's not is it Berenice Abbott that he was married to, or
Dorothea Lange.
Yeah, that Dorothea Lange. She's writing a book about Dorothea Lange. Well, I'm bringing up Maynard Dixon in this book, and it was just sort of this weird because she knew all about it. And apparently they were miserable parents. Just
Yeah.
could not have been worse parents. And but what a fascinating artist. And his there is something out here. There's no, once you get out away from the cities, the quality of the light and the quality of the landscape. I mean, if you're a painter, I can't imagine how you couldn't be drawn to it.
Anybody have any questions?
They had me yesterday.
You're so eloquent. Right.
What was your background before you started writing?
Varied. I studied mathematics in college, but mostly because I went to the Ohio State University, and they didn't have a very good English department. History department was all statistics based, and that didn't interest me. But I stumbled into the math department, and I met this group of men who were the most brilliant, kind, generous, inspirational teachers I had ever met. And I just said, mathematics is going to serve me one way or another, no matter what I do. So I spent, I did my undergrad in mathematics, and then had no clue what I wanted to do in grad school. But I figured I was one of those kids who, I tell people I'm one of those white males who's the most important words in my life up to the age of 24 were "you may break the seal and begin." It was great at standardized tests. I got into Berkeley on a fellowship in linguistics. I figured, I'd won a poetry prize, and I had this mathematics background. George Lakoff thought that was interesting. I was in school for about 6 weeks where something inside me started screaming, saying, "Get me out of here." I tell the way I tell the story now is that I needed to get my nose bloodied and my heart broken. So I left school. I started studying acting and just doing odd jobs to pay the freight as I studied acting. And that's really where I learned how to write. I took the three writers who most inspired me were Tennessee Williams, who taught me character. Arthur Miller, who taught me how to make an idea into a dramatic event. And Pinter, who taught me about subtext. Because in a Pinter play, nobody's ever saying what's really on their minds. You've always got, there's always an agenda. And it creates a natural suspense line by line. So those were like my three big teachers. And then while I'm in acting school, and this is the weird part, two people I'm in acting school with, when they realize I'm trying to figure out whether I want to pursue acting or writing, they go, "Well, we're working for this PI firm, and you ought to get a job here because you can't beat it for material." I bug them for 9 months. They finally hire me. And then at my 6-week review, they say, "We knew you'd be good at the writing aspect, but we didn't think you'd have this good an attitude. I just love the job." And I decided these were going to be my years at sea. Whatever I write about, I can learn about in this world. And I worked in the justice system for about 15 years. And worked on the DeLorean case, People's Temple trial, Cotton Club murder case, Michael Jackson case, Lincoln Savings and Loan, a lot of really, headline cases. And it just, that's what I've been drawing on ever since. And I'd always wanted to be a writer, though. I wasn't a PI who became a writer. I was a writer who became a PI. And,
do you still do any of that work on the side?
No. And what happens, I left PI work to work with my wife at the time. And she was a lawyer. And we just said, let's put out our shingle. And she was in estate planning and probate litigation. We had this little small mom and pop practice. The joke was she's the law, I'm the office. And I would do PI work, and I do everything for her. Everything that didn't require a lawyer, I could do. So, and then she got sick, ovarian cancer in 2000, passed away in 2001. And at that point, I didn't want to go back to it. By then, it was so tied up in working with her. I just couldn't imagine just going back to it just for money. And I just sold the book. We sold Devil's Redhead 6 weeks before she died. And so I just thought, okay, well, my life is changing in more ways than one. So let's just see what happens.
I remember that, actually. now that you mention it.
So that's my background in a nutshell.
On a lighter note, I wanted to ask you about some of these wonderful Spinoza quotes
Oh, yeah.
that you kind of intersperse throughout. Why Spinoza?
Because he died of tuberculosis.
I see. Yeah. There's a great one. I read this one aloud to my wife. I thought that was such a good one.
Yeah, it may easily come to pass that a vain man may become proud and imagine himself pleasing to all when he is in reality a universal nuisance. Yeah, that doesn't resonate with anything right now, no.
It is. Well, this is probably a good time to kind of sign off with our Facebook audience anyway. Thanks a lot for tuning in.